A lot of people know about the PayPal Mafia, how the early team at PayPal went on to found and control some of the biggest tech companies today. But did you know there is a much more powerful, influential business mafia out there? One stemming from a much more shady company than PayPal, who assumed much higher positions of power all over the world. It's called the Goldman Sachs Mafia. This is Henry Paulson. Henry was a very powerful man. He was the former US Secretary of the Treasury, which meant he controlled pretty much every aspect of the federal government's finances. And during the 2008 financial crisis, he was pretty much the person in charge of the entire bailout. He had the pleasure of choosing who to keep afloat and who to let drown in their own debt. He was the guy who essentially let Lehman Brothers implode, and the guy who made sure AIG, the insurance company, got enough money in their bailout to pay Goldman Sachs $13 billion. His pedigree? He spent 32 years at Goldman Sachs. And from 1999 to 2006, he was both its chairman and CEO. Then there's Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton's former Treasury Secretary, who oversaw the loosening of underwriting regulations that had been in place since the 30s. This made it just so much easier for investment banks to bend the rules when it comes to taking companies public. His pedigree? 26 years at Goldman Sachs, even becoming the co-chairman in 1990. The former heads of the Canadian and Italian national banks, former Goldman Sachs employees. Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary under Donald Trump, served 16 years at Goldman Sachs. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. Joshua Bolten, George Bush's chief of staff, served as an executive director at Goldman Sachs for 5 years. Duncan Niederauer, former CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, was also a partner at, let's say it together, Goldman Sachs. The European Central Bank, the National Bank of Greece, the Bank of England, all have employees with deep roots at Goldman. In total, more than 26 former Goldman Sachs employees have taken positions of incredible power and influence all over the world. The world seems to be almost ruled by the alumni of what is generally thought of as the most slimy, the most corrupt investment bank in the world. But how did it get to this point? This is the Goldman Sachs Mafia.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
The loans that were blamed for the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression
was hit today with a record fine of $550 million.
Goldman Sachs, which had a controversial role in the global financial meltdown, one of the giants at the center of that bailout, his former employer, toxic and destructive.
Those bribes in turn resulted in $2.7 billion in losses to 1MDB.
Goldman Sachs had humble beginnings. Cue the typical grassroots backstory of an underdog making it against all odds. The firm was originally started by Marcus Goldman in 1869, and for the first 100 or so years of its existence, it was a pretty regular yet very successful financial firm. Marcus Goldman immigrated to the US in 1848 and started brokering IOUs for entrepreneurs and startups. Basically, he had clients who would give him money. He would then use that money to issue small loans in the form of short-term IOUs to people who wanted to start businesses. Almost immediately after starting, Goldman managed to transact up to $5 million worth of these IOUs a year. In 1882, Goldman's son-in-law Samuel Sachs joined the business, and the name was officially changed to what we know it as today. Business boomed, and within just a few years, Goldman Sachs was turning over $30 million worth of IOUs in a year, and had over $100,000 in capital, around $2.7 million in today's money. Goldman Sachs was the quintessential American dream come true. The family-owned firm built itself up from nothing, and by the time the boom of the 1920s came around, it was ready to start making some serious money. Goldman Sachs started taking a dark turn when it entered the IPO market of 1906, helping take Sears public. The only reason Goldman even got the deal was because Henry Goldman, Marcus Goldman's son, was close friends with the owner of Sears. Suddenly, a lot of banks' focus shifted from issuing IOUs to helping companies go public, a process called underwriting. As an IPO underwriter, Goldman Sachs helped decide the initial offering price of the stocks that were going public, and then they would take them public. And during a time when massive companies like FW Woolworth and Continental Can were going public, being a firm that provided IPO underwriting services was very profitable. And so started a bunch of convoluted financial alchemy to swindle the public out of their money. In every bubble, there's usually some new magical financial instrument that people are going crazy over. In 2008, it was mortgage-backed securities. Today, it could be a bunch of stuff in the crypto space. But back then, leading up to the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, the financial tool that was getting all the hype were investment trusts. So first, Goldman created the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, an investment trust. They launched shares at $100 per piece, bought all those shares with their own money, and then sold 90% of them to the public for $104. They were basically underwriting their own company, which is more than a little sketchy, but they did it anyways and made a sweet profit from it too. But that wasn't enough. The Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation started buying up its own shares back from the public, pushing share prices higher and higher. When the price was high enough, they sold the shares back to the public again, profiting the difference again. And then they sponsored a new trust, the Shenandoah Corporation. It was basically a legal pump and dump, where they would repeatedly pump up the price themselves. The Shenandoah Corporation started issuing millions of dollars of shares soon after its creation. They did the same thing there, and eventually sponsored the creation of another trust called the Blue Ridge Corporation. Goldman Sachs had created what was essentially an investment pyramid scheme. 7.25 million shares were issued by Blue Ridge, and 6.25 million of those shares were owned by Shenandoah, and Shenandoah was basically owned by Goldman Trading. So Goldman hid behind Goldman, who hid behind Goldman, and they made a lot of money doing it. They would just use all the funds the public put into one trust to start a new one to make even more money. The only problem was, if one of the trusts suddenly lost value, you wouldn't be able to pay back the people selling their shares, and the whole pyramid would be massacred. Which was pretty much exactly what happened in the stock market crash of 1929. Goldman Sachs lost the equivalent of $475 billion in today's money, which damaged the bank's liquidity, but it also took out a lot of its competition. All the smaller firms that had invested with Goldman before the crash were basically wiped out, leaving Goldman Sachs to enjoy an almost competition-free playground for a good half a century afterwards. It wouldn't be until the late 90s that Goldman would come across such a lucrative opportunity like the 20s again. By the 90s, Goldman Sachs was the underwriter for some of the biggest organizations in the country. Since the stock market crash, it had built a reputation of being one of the best investment banks in America. The Goldman Sachs of the early 90s played the long game, but that all changed when Robert Rubin, the former co-chairman of Goldman Sachs, became the Treasury Secretary and the Director of the National Economic Council. Whether it was intentional or not, putting such a big supporter of Goldman Sachs in the White House meant a lot of leeway for the bank to color outside the lines. Robert Rubin did nothing to regulate the sudden mass underwriting Goldman Sachs started. Companies that consisted of not much more than a couple ideas scribbled on a napkin were suddenly being taken public via IPO. These dot-com startups were hyped up in the media and sold for millions to the public who had no idea they were buying into nothing. How could this happen? Since 1930, there had been very strict rules when it came to underwriting. A company had to be in business for 5 years and showed 3 years of being profitable. But it looked like Goldman Sachs and pretty much all of Wall Street had thrown this rule out the window. All thanks to Rubin, who didn't seem to care whether his old friends and colleagues made millions by not following the same regulations he was supposed to be enforcing. And Goldman Sachs took advantage as much as they could. Its analysts were telling people that shares were worth $100, even when they knew their clients would be losing money in the end. And the bank took a mix of good and bad companies public, including Yahoo, Webvan, and eToys. Some made money, others crashed and burned. Goldman Sachs were the IPO kings of the internet age, and they were making billions off the mania. Eventually, the music stopped and the dot-com bubble burst, wiping out $5 trillion on the Nasdaq alone. Goldman Sachs got a measly slap on the wrist and a $110 million fine, but for a company that was paying $7 billion a year in salaries alone, that fine was just a fee for doing business. With a new taste for profiting off of economic crises, Goldman Sachs was ready for the next bubble.
Are you directing us to put Lehman into bankruptcy?
Just like the drop in underwriting standards in the 90s, the early 2000s brought even looser regulations, except this time it was around mortgages. In the 90s, people who wanted to buy houses had to meet a lot of criteria. They had to put at least a 10% down payment on the house, prove that they had stable income, and have a good credit score. But then when the 2000s came along, that got thrown out the window too. Suddenly, everyone with a bank account could buy a house. A bunch of bad mortgages were bundled together by investment banks like Goldman into mortgage-backed securities. And to hide the ticking time bomb they were selling, Goldman would get companies like AIG to provide insurance for the mortgage bundles, called credit default swaps. If people defaulted on their mortgages, AIG would reimburse Goldman, so the potential mortgage defaults would be swapped from Goldman to AIG. And all of this was made possible by Robert Rubin, who made sure Congress passed an act protecting investment banks' rights to continue selling mortgages even though they knew there was a big chance buyers wouldn't be getting any money from them, and companies like AIG would have to make up the difference. When the bubble bursted, Goldman Sachs profited big time, and when everything went down the drain, they turned to AIG and said, well, you insured all these securities for us, time to pay up. And that's where Henry Paulson comes in. After 3 decades at Goldman Sachs, Henry Paulson stepped down as the chairman and CEO of Goldman to become the Treasury Secretary of the United States in 2007.
I announce that I will nominate Henry Paulson to be the Secretary of the Treasury.
Just a year later, he was Goldman Sachs' knight in shining armor. Paulson was the guy who chose not to help Lehman Brothers, one of Goldman's competitors, when they were going down. He was also the guy who made sure that as soon as Lehman sank, a $700 billion bailout package was created. And he made extra sure that AIG, who owed Goldman Sachs the insurance money for defaulting mortgages, had enough cash injected in them to repay Goldman the $13 billion it owed. Goldman Sachs ended up being paid in full for its bad bets, all thanks to a friend in a very high place. But that wasn't all. In order to get even more bailout money, Goldman Sachs was converted from an investment bank to a bank holding company. It got $10 billion in relief. It came under the regulation of Stephen Friedman, an ex-Goldman Sachs employee, and could still afford to pay its employees $11 billion in bonuses in the first half of 2009.
Goldman Sachs didn't suffer at all. Goldman Sachs has had its best years since the mortgage meltdown and since the worldwide economic crisis. They knew the mortgages would fail. They never told anyone.
And what was Goldman Sachs' punishment for hiding the true value of mortgages that it sold? Returning a measly $14 million to the Treasury, less than a third of the CEO's salary that same year, and paying a few pathetic fines in the tens of millions, which again is the cost of doing business.
Remember, for Goldman to be winners, there had to be losers. And as we know now.
After 2008, people were obviously reluctant to put their money into any more convoluted financial instruments, so Goldman had to find something more real, more physical. So they turned to the commodities market. When gas prices hit $4.11 a gallon in 2008, the government wrote it off as having an issue with supply. But it was far from the truth. The supply of crude oil had actually been increasing and demand decreasing, so the price of gas should have gone down, if it wasn't for Goldman Sachs. You see, Goldman and a lot of other powerful firms had switched to trading oil futures. Basically, they were getting the same pension funds and other big investors from the housing mania to agree to buy oil at a certain price on a certain date. So oil futures became the go-to tool for Goldman and other big banks to speculate on. And by 2008, a barrel of oil was traded 27 times before actually being delivered and used. And with each trade, the price increased. Eventually, people owned more future barrel oils than there were actual barrels of oil in existence. Goldman promised people ever-increasing oil prices, and when in mid-2008, crude oil prices dropped from $147 to $33, Goldman decided it was time to bail. And once again, the losers were regular people who couldn't get out before the drop. Just one pension fund, the California Public Employees Retirement System, had $1.1 billion in commodities when the crash came. And crazy oil prices have pushed food costs up so high that more than 100 million people around the world were forced into hunger. And it was all thanks to Goldman Sachs.
Anyone else?
Through the years, Goldman Sachs has been accused of dozens of different crimes or violations. There's literally an entire Wikipedia page just titled Goldman Sachs Controversies, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. Kickback bribes, insider trading, intentionally undervaluing IPOs, and putting their own interests in front of their clients. That's just some of what Goldman Sachs has been accused of over the years. And it eventually got so bad that the vice president of one of Goldman Sachs' departments, a guy named Greg Smith, wrote a public letter of resignation. Now, I don't know if Greg Smith had anything to gain with resigning publicly and going on a bunch of interviews, but he does give us a rare glimpse into the behemoth.
When people leave Goldman, they tend to do it quietly. Greg Smith is talking for the first time about what led him to leave the firm and to do it in such a public way. It makes me ill how callously people talk about ripping their clients off.
Goldman Sachs and other firms on Wall Street started learning how to use the information they were getting from their clients in order to bet with their own money, at times betting against their clients. The quickest way to make money on Wall Street is to take the most sophisticated product and try to sell it to the least sophisticated client. In Europe, a muppet is a term for someone you can manipulate, someone who is an idiot.
Wall Street isn't exactly known for taking the moral high road when it comes to profits, but Goldman Sachs has proven to be the best at taking this to an extreme.
Wall Street ethics is a sort of oxymoron. People who work at Goldman Sachs don't talk about working at Goldman Sachs.
It's like Fight Club?
It is a little bit, or maybe like the mafia, that people are reluctant to talk about what's happened there.
You are betting against the very product you are selling, and you're just not troubled by it.
I'm sorry, I can't endorse your characterization.